This is We the Sales Engineers Podcast, show 181.
Welcome to We the SEs Podcast, the show for sales engineers by sales engineers with your host, Ramsey Majaba.
What's up, SE Nation? Welcome back to another episode. I am your host, Ramsey Majaba. My co-host, Benny the Beard Kanungu, will be joining me during the interview, just not the intro and the outro. And I find myself saying this a lot, but we had a great guest today. And it's... I say it a lot because we tend to have great guests, and I'm appreciative to every single one of them who provided their time and knowledge on the show. And today we're taking a bit of a different approach. We're talking to a gentleman by the name of Joseph Fung. He's the founder of multiple companies throughout the years, and today he runs a company called Uvaro, which he will explain about a little bit later. And we wanted to talk about the startup mentality, how things work, and we discuss a lot of things about like how startups grow and who are their first hires, and how the role of the CEO changes as they grow, how the SE role or where the SE role comes in, what are some of the mistakes, who the first hire should be, at least in the sales organization. So we talk about a lot of different things, and he brings a different perspective, which I really enjoyed, and thoughtfulness to his answers. So I really enjoyed this show. I'm not going to belabor the point. Let's just jump right in. Good morning, Joseph. How are you doing?
Hey, good morning. How's it going?
We're going well. It's Monday morning. We're recording this, so hopefully we're all fresh. And maybe we can get started the same way we get started in every other show. Maybe introduce yourself to the folks listening.
Happy to. So I'm Joseph Fung, co-founder and CEO at Uvaro, 5 times entrepreneur, and now helping folks transition into the tech industry through sales roles. And so that's a lot of AEs, SDRs, and of course, sales engineering.
Nice. So just before we get started, like, what is Uvaro? Where did you come up with the name? What do you do there? Maybe
For
we'll
sure.
start there.
It's a career success platform. So we provide just-in-time training, virtual apprenticeships, and then job matching. And so we help folks learn how to sell technology, help them figure out where they fit in best in the tech ecosystem, and then introduce them to amazing tech companies. So our grads have gone on to everything from Adobe and to Oracle at the large enterprise side to smaller startups and everything in between.
Okay, nice. So you work with a lot of people in sales, like the big umbrella of sales, right? Technical,
right.
Non-technical. Something that we kind of struggle with when I see startups is that they don't have sales engineers. It's the software designer who's designed the product, does the demos, and there is no official role for sales engineers, and many companies forget to hire one.
Yes.
How do you see the role of pre-sales? Let's stay with pre-sales in general, so sales and sales engineering and whatever it is. How do you see that role changing when the company starts up, and when do you hire your first sales engineer?
Yeah, it's always interesting because there's two. If you think about a company, a startup that's going through that maturation and evolving, there's actually two forces at play that sometimes cause some confusion. The first one is just the company's maturing. Roles become more specialized. You learn what it takes to actually sell. You learn what discovery questions work, what stories to share. You get more mature as a company, and that's one force at play. But the second force at play that can help that or hinder it is the CEO, the founders' evolution themselves. Because a lot of CEOs get confused, where they're selling at the beginning, they're closing deals, and they think they're being an AE when in fact they're actually being a sales engineer, and they don't know how to get themselves out of the way of their team, and they don't know how to replace themselves in that cycle. So the big challenge is, as you mature, you've got to specialize. And sometimes your founder or your CEO can make that a very difficult process through, no bad intention, just through the process of being a CEO and a founder. You don't always recognize where things are specializing.
I'm working with one sales engineer right now who has a CEO. Like, it's a startup, and the CEO is still doing all the demos. Yep. And they're not doing it the right way because they've never been sales engineers in their lives. So when you get into that position where a CEO is doing these demos and trying to close deals, how do you get them out of, like, how is it possible to get a CEO out of that role so that they can hire people who are experts, because the CEO's role is to be the visionary, figure out what's the next steps that we're going to take, not necessarily clicking every button during the demo. How do we get them out of that role?
Yeah, it's always a tough one. It's a hard thing to say, hey, I know you built this, but you're doing it all wrong. This is no silver bullet. But what I found often helps is that CEO often, what they don't realize is that the way they're selling, no one else can. It's just impossible. And so what happens is you bring on sales reps, you bring on sales engineers, they don't do it the way you do. And it makes it very frustrating. And as a leader, you're like, wow, why can't I just hire people who do what I want them to do? And they lose sight of the fact that what they're doing is not replicable. And this is a very basic thing. Like, I mean, like Benny and Ramsey, if you think about it, I call you up and I'm like, hey guys, I'm this founder. I've got this new product. I'd love to show you what it's like. I mean, that the whole social dynamic is you want the underdog to win.
Yeah.
But then when that sales rep calls you up and says, hey, Ramsey, Benny, I've got this cool product. I'd love to show you. It's like, no, the walls go up. There's this huge blocker. And very often CEOs, founders, they don't realize that they've kind of got this reality distortion field around them. Not the way they see reality, but the way people see them. And so if you can get them comfortable with the idea that you have to hire people who can sell successfully, and it won't be the way you sell, once that cognitive switch flicks, it's a lot easier to say, hey, now let's actually bring in a professional sales engineer. Let's bring in professional sales leadership, because they've proven how to make it work. They're not just trying to copy what you're doing and failing. And so a large part of it, it's not just about what's the process or what's the checklist, but it's helping that CEO, that founder, overcome that mental block that you can't repeat what they're doing. You just can't.
And I guess when you say you can't really repeat what the CEO is doing, like I think you kind of alluded to it a little bit earlier when you were just speaking, but is that from a process and methodology perspective versus like a passion perspective? Yeah.
I say it's actually not either. You're right, absolutely. The passion is often there, but I mean, I've seen sales reps who are super excited about problems. I mean, the passion comes through. I don't think it's a process thing, because most of the founders, CEOs I know who are selling, they've got no process. They're going to click buttons and say things until you're excited enough to buy. The large part is just the social contract.
Fair enough. The perception. Yeah, true.
If you're talking to the CEO of the company, they can make decisions. If you're talking to the CEO of the company and they say, hey, no, we know you can help you, there's more gravitas there than when an AE or an SE says that. So this social construct is just totally different when that founder or CEO title is on the Zoom call or on the phone.
No, I think it's totally fair. Yeah, even just like not quite the same level of experience, but back in the my student days, when I was selling paint jobs, like interior, exterior paint jobs and whatnot, I did okay. But the perception with I guess when I had either my manager or even the owner of the company with me on a sales call, just the perception of the client or the prospect on those calls with us just seemed a little bit far more open and far more like, oh, you'd be willing to do that for me? Okay, cool. And
totally.
in the back of my head, I'd always be thinking like, hey, I would said the exact same thing. But you're totally right. That perception of speaking to the head honcho there definitely does kind of change the dynamic.
The interesting thing is very often CEOs don't realize that. Our team often talks about it. When you're selling, when you're working a deal, you can bring in that executive, that CEO pixie dust. You're working a deal, and you're like, okay, I'm going to have the CEO join on, or I'm going to have the head of operations join on. And it really is like sprinkling a bit of pixie dust on the deal. And if you can help your CEO recognize that their impact is huge and we can use it strategically, you can actually get them involved in more deals for this thinner slice. And if you coach them, you say, hey, I want you to talk about this client because you know them really well, and about this one feature. That's it. Because we just need to help them feel more confident about this one thing. And I'm going to tag you in at that point in a demo. If you can coach them really well and be really specific about where they get involved, then they can kind of keep their fingers, involved and, feel like they're influencing, but also make a bigger impact because they're being leveraged more strategically.
That's a really cool point. I like that a lot. The idea of pre-coaching the CEO before getting into the call with them, rather than going the other way around. They're kind of hoping for the best with them in the room. That's awesome.
Think about it. As a sales engineer, I mean, you want to have the lay of the land before you come in for a demo, right? Yeah. Totally. Same kind of thing. If you're going to bring an executive in, it's like, hey, here's the points, here's the people, here's what we need from you.
Amazing.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like you need the boots. You need to, as a CEO, you want to tell the people on the ground, the boots on the ground, what to do. But then again, they're on the ground and they know exactly what's happening. So when you come to the ground, they should be able to tell you what to do as well. In terms of hiring, like if you're a CEO and like you're a solopreneur at this point, and now you you got some funding, you hired some software designers to help you build the product. Who do you hire first in the sales department?
It totally depends on your strengths. And so if we think about a software organization, so as a CEO, you can't be thinking about what you need right now. You can't be thinking about what you need tomorrow. You got to be thinking about a little further out. And so if you're a software company, this is not a guaranteed thing, but it's a good chance you'll end up having a mid-market product where you've got sales development reps, account executives, sales engineers. You'll probably have those in kind of three kind of core roles. As a founder, as a CEO, you need to really think, what are you good at? And so, good example for me, I'll reflect on myself. I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Twitter all the time.
You saw mute.
Yeah.
I thought I had the mute covered for that cough, but sorry, didn't get him off.
You did for the cough. Good. The cough was perfect. But
I got the first half right. We'll blame this on a demo hiccup, because those never happen, right?
It's technology.
Yeah. So for myself, I know that I naturally lean towards the sales development functions. Like naturally, I'll introduce people, I'll get them into the hopper, and where I drop the ball is on running a process. And so I know if I'm thinking about my weaknesses and strengths, I really need to make sure I'm bringing on an AE to help run processes, because that's where we're going to struggle if I'm owning it more. So as a CEO, you got to start with those roles where you've got the biggest weakness. Wow, Monday mornings, frog in the throat.
Yeah, that makes sense. So there's a differentiation. You just said you would hire AEs who could run the process. So that means you don't hire any AE, because a lot of AEs are just disorganized as many other people. Right? So you would hire people with that specific talent.
Totally. I mean, if we think about the roles of them, especially early on, your SDRs are filling in your top of your funnel, your AEs are working those deals, being really accurate in their predictions. I mean, their number one job is to forecast the future, which deals are going to close, which ones aren't. And your sales engineering organization is about, closing that gap between what the product does, like what it can do, and what it should do for this customer, and helping them realize that vision. And as a CEO, as a founder, you're going to be strong at different areas, and you've got to fill those gaps. And I've seen the others. I've seen CEOs where they are selling machines. They can work the deal, they can run the process, and every deal they close just goes sideways. And the team's like, why did we close this customer? And that's where they need to have a really good sales engineer. You can help actually say, this is what we're going to deliver. This is how, the feature, the button, the configuration solves a problem, and manage those expectations. So yeah, figuring out and holding a really good mirror to yourself as a founder, it's hard and it's really tough, but that's the best way to prioritize what to hire first.
So interesting.
Go ahead, Benny.
All right, thanks. Yeah, I was going to say, so I've heard a lot of definitely like hiring for the moment, especially from an executive perspective. So, just what you're saying now is really cool. I've never really thought about it so much from an employee perspective, and hiring an employee based upon the personality traits of, let's say, oneself to make sure you're countering it. From an executive perspective, I've heard it a lot, different organizations, the same organization rather will hire and just get rid of and get new executives based upon the stage of business that they're in because of different, connections and capabilities and whatnot. Can the same be said for the first few employees though, where maybe the first employees that you hire may be entirely different than employees that you hire at a later stage, like a mid-stage of your business or a more mature stage, or are employees pretty ubiquitous across the board?
No, that's very, very true. So I'm glad you brought it up, because it's a really big truth that early stage employees often don't grow in the same direction that the business does. And that's not, it's not them, it's not the business, it's just people and organizations evolve, and sometimes they evolve in different directions. And so if someone's on the call and they're listening in, like, it's not a sign of failure. It's not a sign of, couldn't cut it. It's that where you want to go as an individual might not be where the company wants to go. Like that sales engineer, the more the company matures, the narrower and narrower their scope. And as an individual, you might not want that. You might not want to be just that specialist. You like being that generalist, and maybe that's not the right fit. And maybe the organization does need to bring somebody else in, and you need to find a different organization. It's really true. Specifically to the sales engineering role, the one thing that does become really apparent as an organization matures is that sense of, you'll hear this on the engineering side, that T-shaped developer. They know a little bit about a lot of things, a very shallow, broad area, and then there's one area where they're very, very deep.
Yep.
That analogy becomes very true very quickly in sales engineering. That depth shows up the moment the company says they're going to start to specialize, and that comes in verticalization or segment stratification or geo focusing. The moment the company starts to do that, your sales engineering team has to get very T-shaped very quickly. That's a really painful process for a lot of people, because where they used to be valued as just a broad generalist suddenly no longer feels valuable, or folks who seem to be too focused suddenly seem to have a lot of leverage in the organization. And that's a very painful process.
So in my world, when we talk about generalists, it usually means that we have a lot of products that we need to know about.
Yep.
But when you're talking about a startup, they don't generally have that many products, maybe one or two they're trying to sell. So what are they generalists at when they're in the startup?
Well, in the early stage startup, they're a generalist in the breadth of customers, because they've seen a law firm, they've seen a manufacturer, they've seen an auto dealership, they've seen all the customers, so they can think of all the potential use cases.
Right.
They also know all the features. They know how the reporting works. They know how the user permissions work. They know how whatever features you have when you're listening into this, they know all of them. But so a really classical process. Startups will often specialize by industry. Right. They'll say, great, actually, the way we sell to software companies, because we know them, is different than the way we sell to, let's call it accounting and legal firms, hypothetically. Yeah. And so that sales engineer who does, really, really well, gets the software bucket because they know the software company, and you bring in a new sales engineer and you're like, wow, this person's technical, but they had 2 years as an accountant and they struggle a little bit using software sometimes, but I don't get how they fit in. How are they a sales engineer? And you see them flourish focusing on the legal and the accounting space because they know that buyer so well. And they've implemented software like yours, and they know how to make it dance and sing for that industry. And it's a really good example where someone who doesn't look like the previous sales engineers is really flourishing because the company is specializing by industry. Same thing can happen by geo or by size, like small business and enterprise.
I've also seen, like, in terms of when you're in a startup, your role is also generalized. Like, you're a sales engineer by name, but you might be doing a little bit of sales, you might be doing a little bit of marketing, you might be doing a whole bunch of, like, just wearing too many hats. And if you love that and this company is growing, your role is shrinking, you're focusing on that. So that could be another area as well.
It
what
is.
are your thoughts about that?
That often happens. What I'd actually suggest is those situations where someone's actually wearing multiple hats. That's a good sign that leadership doesn't really have their. I don't know if maybe we're not supposed to swear on this podcast. They don't have their ducks in a row. Let's use that metaphor.
It's very Canadian of you not to swear on
this. There we go. Yeah. The reality though is it's a miserable pain to say, oh, by the way, you've got 2 jobs. Right. You're marketing and you're selling. You're selling and you're supporting, and you're doing demos and you're building leads. Like, what? It's just, no one can flourish in that structure. A better way to think about it for an executive team or a founding team, or if you're on an early stage startup and you're trying to support each other, a good way to think about it is you have your primary responsibility, but the organization is so small, there is no momentum. Like, there is no inherent safety net. It's not like, oh, if Samantha doesn't pick up the support ticket, there's 3 other agents who can pick it up. No, it's Samantha. Or if Jim doesn't get those leads, there's somebody else who will get those leads. No, there's no backup. So everyone has their primary function, but we've got to have our radar out to keep an eye on everyone's roles. And as the company matures, you can keep your radar out because now there's more systems, there's more processes, there's more people. So you don't have to be that safety net as much. And if you can have an organization where you encourage that mutual support, you're going to really win. And you've got to give people the liberty to realize job number 1 is where they need to succeed. Everything else is really where they're just helping each other out. They're not trying to own multiple hats, because multiple hats is what leads to burnout so fast. That's tough. I feel so much better knowing that I'm not the only one who had the mute block there. Thank you, Benny. I know you were just making me feel better, but
Benny makes every guest feel better by doing that.
Indeed. Yeah, man of the people. I was going to say, oh yeah, no, I just wanted to reinforce what you just mentioned. I know Ramsey's talked about it as well. When you're kind of working with managers or when your leadership or who you're directly reporting to isn't in full alignment with your mandate, or if you have to report to two different people that might have competing mandates. I know I had a similar type of experience when on a product team, but also moonlighted as a sales engineer. And so we'd say certain things in sales calls, but the product side would be like, wait a second, like, how'd you guys say this? Or why'd you guys say this? And we had to say it. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Definitely can see how it contributes though to that burnout, because you don't even know if you're doing it right anymore, because you have one manager telling you one thing, another manager telling you another thing. And one to get their ducks in a row is definitely a good thing to do when they find themselves in that position, or to recommend those above them to get their ducks in a row, I guess, is definitely something to do in that situation.
Totally. That sense of safety in your action is so critical.
Totally.
From my experience, when I talk to startup founders, sales engineering isn't really on the roadmap for their hires. It's usually salespeople and SDRs.
Mm-hmm.
I am curious. So, as you've founded multiple companies, mm-hmm. what are your thoughts about that?
I think the real challenge is that for a lot of that wasn't the right way to start it. Most founders haven't had the good fortune to work inside a high-performing sales organization, so there's no surprise that they've got blind spots. And when they think about their own experiences, they think about buying software. They've talked to SDRs, they've talked to AEs. And so it's really easy to say, oh, we need to have these roles. But they probably haven't worked alongside or talked to sales engineers, technical account managers, sales enablement leads, channel sales managers, all of these different roles. And so it doesn't come naturally. And moreover, we teach ourselves as founders to say the incumbent process is wrong. That's what we do every day. We're like, hey, the way companies did something was wrong. So then it's really easy to assume the way they structure their sales organization is wrong. The way they structure their support organization is wrong. So it's really easy to assume you have to throw out everything that's been there. The sales engineer role, it's really come through a renaissance, but it's not a brand new role. I mean, ever since we've been selling mainframes, sales engineering has been a function. The challenge is most CEOs haven't seen it work successfully. So what we really talk about, what we really try to help emphasize to founders is when your product gets to a point of maturity where there's some type of configuration and implementation. When you have an implementation process, chances are you need sales engineering. And so using that kind of rough heuristic is a good way to think about when you're going to need it, because as soon as you have that type of implementation process, that means you have a translation process. From what the product does out of the box to what you need to do to succeed. And that means you probably need a sales engineering function to help close that.
So if you're implementing, you need sales engineer. Did I understand that correctly?
It's a good rule of thumb. It's not a be all end all, because of course there's other factors even if there's an implementation process, if it is a small cost, a low cost product, there might not be enough in the cost of acquisition budget to support all the additional headcount. So you shouldn't break your model, but it's a very good heuristic. If you've got an implementation, you probably need SEs.
Nice.
Yeah. I don't know, Ramsey, should I ask that?
Yeah, go ahead. I'm just taking it all in.
All right, cool, fair enough. So a little bit off track here, a bit, I guess, but it's still all related. Were there any unexpected maybe findings that you had when developing AEs and SDRs versus sales engineers, or was everything pretty par for the course for you?
So one of the interesting things that really jumped out was the number of folks who have an AE or an SDR background who want to be sales engineers.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. So what was not a surprise at all was a lot of people who come from a product or an engineering side of things who say, you know what, I think I could be good at this sales thing. I love the attractiveness of that commission, and they look at sales engineering. I think we all know somebody or have been somebody who's gone through that journey. What was really interesting was the number of AEs who said, I would love to be a sales engineer. And maybe they had a technical background, or maybe they just really like technology. But that career path is a very compelling one to so many. And that was a big surprise to me. I didn't anticipate that.
What are your thoughts about why that is?
A large part of it, I think, has to do with the move towards more subscription products. So sales reps of kind of yesteryear were ones who get that high, that rush from closing the deal. Yeah. High fives, awesome. Let's go spend some of that commission check. And that works out well when you got really big deals and then nothing for a year and a half. For those people who gravitate towards a subscription economy, you're really just solving problems. And if you don't solve a problem, the customer leaves. And so today's sales reps tend to be much more solution oriented. Like, hey, you got a pain point, we're going to solve it. And there's that deep empathy. The challenge when you're an AE is it often feels like you can't take it to the finish line. Your hands are tied. Your job is done when you get that contract signed. And so having a sales engineering role where you can actually help them maybe realize that success a little bit more, hand it off to the implementation team and be more involved there. I think that desire to see solutions to completeness is what's driving it. But it's an interesting one. It's one that we've seen emerge, and we haven't seen if it's part of a long-term trend or not, but it's something we're definitely seeing now.
So I talked to a lot of AEs and SDRs who want to do that move from to sales engineering. What are some of the qualities that you found in those who were successful in the shift from AE, SDR, or BDR, whatever you want to call, to sales engineering?
This is going to sound really, really cliched, perhaps, but kind of success in the first role often leads to success in the second role.
Right.
And I think that's more of a side effect of how sales is evolving than a comment on sales engineering. So sales has become much more about running the process. It's not being about that, magical relationship manager who just, pulls a deal out of nowhere. It's like, hey, I know my process. I know how to convert it. I know how to manage those expectations throughout. People who are successful at that often have a lot of the same characteristics to be successful in sales engineering. And that, I don't mean that that's all of the characteristics they need, but it's a very strong indicator. And if you're not successful at doing that, you're not successful at running the process, managing expectations, keeping your systems clean, it's a lot harder to be successful as an SE. So that's one that I would emphasize as a high criteria. And then there's all the other obvious ones around, comfort using technology, making it work, solving problems, doing your own debugging, all those things necessary to run really great demos and configure things for a unique customer. But you don't get to do those in the AE role, so it's hard to evaluate those for an account executive. It's a lot easier to evaluate process adherence, solutions orientation, and actual, running that cycle.
Imagine too that if that driving reason for those people that want to jump over is more that to find that more fulfilling role, to be able to see that process or to see that sales cycle from beginning to end, and then past that as well, that just that motivation alone is also probably a nice indicator to say, oh wow, this person really cares to kind of, one, kind of solve the problem for this customer, but also be there, be involved throughout and keep them engaged. And like you said, following the process, but with that idea of wanting to feel fulfilled in this role of experiencing that full, well-rounded sales cycle, I suppose.
Totally.
Yeah, that's super interesting.
What I do see when I think about the engineers I know who have moved into sales engineering versus the account executives who have moved into sales engineering, one of the things I do see is a much better alignment to the revenue numbers. Just that natural understanding of like, yeah, we got to do this to close deals. Yes, we've hit our team's target. We've hit our country's target, and knowing that they've got an accountability to that. I have seen more engineers who come in and there's still this sense of disassociation, not necessarily the same deep intrinsic sense of responsibility yet. And I think coming from the other side, that's the one thing that I'd encourage folks to really reinforce, because unless you're accountable for the revenue number, it's hard to say you're really part of the revenue organization. And that's kind of an internal thing. I mean, your comp plan, your commissions, but it's like how you feel about it inside.
One thing I noticed also in terms of the differences is when you move an engineer into a sales engineering role, they want to know the product very well, which is great. You need to know the product very well, but they also want to show everything about the product to the customer, and they're more product focused, which is, it makes sense. We're engineers. That's what we studied to be engineers, to focus on the product instead of being customer focused. Like, what does the product do for them? Why am I clicking this button? The so what test everyone talks about. I clicked this button and nothing happened. So what? Where do I care about? Why does the customer care about that? So there are benefits to, I guess, ignorance is sometimes a good thing, although they have to learn and get better at knowing the product. Just the way they think about it might be different. And I guess I just thought of it this instant right now. Well, thanks for that.
It's the exact same problem that founders have. That same thing. It's like we care so much about the product because we built it and we know it. And we got to get outside of our heads and get inside of the customer heads. What do they care about? And as the company matures and they start to specialize more, that's where that really shines through. I've seen successful sales engineers who never actually demo the product. They talk entirely about the pain points that the business has had because they know that industry. Maybe they've been a leader in that industry for 20 years and they can talk through the implementations and talk through the pain points. And it feels really weird. You have to say that, okay, a sales engineer that doesn't really know the product at all. But their job is to help those customers on a journey. And when you know the problem of the customers and you know the way this product solves it, those are the killer combination. And that doesn't always mean, being an expert in every single nook and cranny of the product.
Agreed. Yeah. Even on the flip side of that, so I came from a non-technical background and kind of fell into sales engineering. And there was definitely such a while, or a pretty decent while, where I'd have that opposite issue of having a pretty decent understanding of how we solve the business problems, but not necessarily, knowing every nook and cranny of the product. And if anything, feeling quite, what's the word? I can't think of the word offhand, but just not confident, I guess there's a better word for it, about the product and my capabilities on it. And so almost like this opposite of confidence, I guess, that I had. Wow, I can't think of the word. Doubt.
Sounds like imposter syndrome, maybe.
Not even so much imposter syndrome, so much as just stressing out about the fact that, hey, like I know that I don't know this part of the product, and this is like, I feel like this is a detriment to me. And that's just a thought in the back of my mind. But I guess outwardly, I'd be speaking about the different benefits or whatever of the product that I understood well and how we solved their issues and whatnot, but just not really knowing how the product did it. And I guess maybe that fear I had was maybe a little bit more unfounded than it needs to be around, shoot, like they're going to see right through this. They're going to see the fact I don't know anything about the product and this is all going to go poorly. But in reality, it actually turned out quite fine. And it's kind of cool to see the other side of that, to know that, you could have that technical know-how, but not necessarily know that you need to know the problems of the customer. And that's kind of the issue that the engineering side might have. So it's just something to think about, or something that I've rather thought about, just hearing everything that y'all had to say so far.
It's interesting. I think as you're saying that, I can hear so much about, I hear so much commentary about engineering organizations in that, in like, we put engineers on a pedestal. It's like, hey, they're building the product. We're very protective of them when we're speaking to customers. Like, no, you can't talk to the engineering team. Here's this technical account manager you could talk to. They're the ones who make all this magic happen. And as a result, their values end up, being characterized as, like true organizational values. Like as an engineer, you value knowing the product really well. And it makes sense. You're working on some software, somebody else works on some software and they screw it up. And you go, yeah, well, they didn't understand all the implications. It's a huge value judgment. And then engineers, and I say this being an engineer, we carry that into our other conversations. Benny's working on a demo and, clicked a different button. And in our heads, we're like, oh, he doesn't know the product as well. And in reality, that's an okay thing, but it comes across as a very judgmental statement. And because the whole organization put engineers on this pedestal, everybody starts adopting that language. They're like, oh, Benny didn't know the product. Like, come on, he doesn't need to know that button in order to sell and be a great sales engineer. I mean, why are we doing that? But we do that all the time.
Here's the thing that I've noticed as well. Because engineers know everything, they want to talk about everything, and they want, like you mentioned, Benny, that yes, you don't know how this thing works in the background. We don't need to know that. We just need to know what it solves.
Yeah,
totally.
And I've been in demos with engineers, and there's like, I'm going to show you this cool thing that I'm going to do, and they click on that button. It's like nothing happened. Oh, in the background, this is what's happening. All right, but how does that help the customer? So again, we're going back to, it's a different skill set. And that's something that I want to ask you, Joseph. People come into your company, and where do you see they're lacking? And what do they, like if someone wants to switch from SE to AE, for example, what should they be working on to prepare for that role.
So somebody's in a sales engineering role and they want to move to an account executive role. Yeah.
And vice versa. We'll talk about both.
I'll talk about that first one, because the really interesting one, so folks who are making that change, one of the big things we always need to hammer home is don't show the product.
Okay.
It sounds really silly, but we use strong language like that to help overcome some biases. It's like, don't show the product. You're on a 30-minute call, 25 minutes should be not showing the product. And the reason why is, as a sales engineer, you're only ever speaking to people where the company has already figured out what their problem is, where their pains are, and how they're planning to solve it. As an account executive, your job is to uncover those pains, uncover those difficulties, figure out how you're going to solve it. And if you're talking about a product, you can't uncover those things. Like, you're going to show 10 different things, and the reality is they only need one or two. And because they don't know what they need, you get into this panic mode. I'm going to show you this, and you can see the body language that didn't stick. So you show them the next thing, and that didn't stick. So you show them the next thing, and like, before you know it, you're just kind of like throwing things out, and hopefully something sticks. No, you got to not show the product, and instead ask more and more questions. And the more you can discover, then the more specific and targeted you can be. And I'm sure as a sales engineer, folks who are listening in can hear that. They could think about the demos they've run where the AE was like, this is the problem, start with this, do, and the demo goes well. Versus the calls where the AE is like, they just want to see it before they sign the check. That's a recipe for disaster, because they don't know what they want to see.
I do want, so there's one thing that I just heard you say, that sales engineers usually come in and the problem is known. And I feel like that's very dependent on the industry that you're in. If it's a software, non-complicated software, that's very likely. But in a lot of industries like IT and all that, the account managers don't know what questions to ask. So they focus on timing, budget, and that sort of thing. And the sales engineer is the one who's doing the discovery. So that same skill, and I see sales engineers do that a lot. They will spend 35 minutes where they're showing the product, but they didn't ask any questions. And like the thing that popped in my mind, if you're showing, you're not asking. So I that skill works for both, I guess.
So the one thing I'd kind of bounce back a little bit, you mentioned how it's dependent on industry. The one thing I'd say is that it's definitely correlated to industry, but I think the actual issue is how good the account managers, the account reps are doing their discovery. And some industries are more competitive, so people have to be top of their game. Some industries are catching up, and so there's a lot of sloppy selling that's happening. But if you're an SC that's in that situation where you're getting pulled into call after call and there's no discovery done, that's a good sign that A, the sales team could use some coaching, or B, there's an opportunity to be that account executive and just crush it because no one else is doing that job right.
Yeah. So a lot of sales people come from different industries. Like if you're in the networking world, from what my experience, sales people will never be able to answer all the questions or ask all the right questions just because it's so complicated. But they have to have the basics down. And in a lot of industries, a lot of the salespeople have to ask should be able to ask the right questions. I've just noticed that they don't. So
that's it. There's sloppiness.
I want to be part of discovery call. Like I want to be, but I am tied 1-to-1 with my salesperson. If there's an SE tied 1-to-10 salespeople, that's where it gets difficult.
So that's an interesting one that you bring up, because one of the things we've seen as organizations scale and as they mature, those linkages become more and more complex, because you get a few sales engineers supporting a large pool of sales reps, and then you get some specialist sales engineers that are more an overlay over the whole sales organization. And your sales engineering organization almost becomes like a matrix in and of itself. And those relationships become really complex. Managed well, you can close way better deals, but wow, it becomes chaotic really quickly.
Yeah, I wrote a blog post where the pros and cons of being tied 1-to-1 versus 1-to-many. And I prefer it being tied 1-to-1 because I have clarity of the opportunities I'm working on. I have a good relationship with my account manager, and I own the customers, right? I own the technical relationships, where if there's an SE is tied 1-to-10, they don't own any of that. They're just there to answer. Like whenever the salesperson pulls them in, it's like, oh, where am I? Which opportunity is this? Right? So yeah, it gets very complicated very quickly. I agree with that.
That's a really good example of, I think, how the personal kind of direction and preferences for an individual can influence which kind of company they want to be at. Because
Yeah.
Just as you talked about having that control and that, that lack of so that kind of chaos when you're just pulled into a call. I've seen other folks who really flourish and thrive for that. Like, great, I don't know who I'm going to talk to today, but I'm going to solve some problems. And we'll see. Maybe it's someone in Miami, and maybe it's a different industry in the UK today. So I think that's a really good indicator that the stage a company definitely leans towards different individuals. And that's not a right or a wrong. It's just, where do you feel fulfilled is really important.
I love that, because in my mind, I never imagined anyone would want that. But, I'm glad that there's someone out there like telling me, like, hey, maybe you need to get educated on.
I see Benny's head going up. Yeah.
It's funny. Yeah, I talk to Benny all the time. I didn't even know he liked that. So it's interesting when people are in their own mental bubble, and you get people like yourself to kind of burst it. And now I learned something. So that's great. Thank you.
Kind of cool how the conversation almost went full circle. Like, it's really interesting how, people are so different in their own different ways, and, how any one individual fits into any one role in an organization will vary from person to person, but then also to what we were speaking to earlier, where they fit into that organization, if they do, at what stage that organization's in, depending on who else is on that team and maybe who's running it, what their priorities and strengths are. It is really cool to know that there are all these different types of roles that cater to all these different types of people, and one way or another, there's always that match to be found, but it's not always guaranteed, which is kind of cool when thinking about sales engineering, just a super ubiquitous role to be able to fit so many different types of people.
It really is. We paint sales engineering, we paint account executives, we paint SDRs with these really broad brushes, and there's so much nuance and subtlety in it. And that's the part I enjoy about my work. We get to see that every day when we help people identify that really good match, how fulfilled and excited they are. And that's true, again, whether it's an AE or an SE role, it's so much more about the organization, the industry, the customers. Yeah, there's a great variety, and it's exploding. There's going to be so many more. So it's a fun time to be looking at it.
Very true.
This has been great so far, Joseph. I know we have a limited time, so I'm going to move on to the not so fire round. These are the same 4 questions we ask almost every guest. And generally speaking, it takes another 15, 20 minutes. But since we're limited in time, we can do it as fast or as slow as you want. So
let's go.
Benny, you want to start us off?
Yes, sir. All right. So you've talked a lot about, I think, what drives people, to move roles, or even what drives people within their roles. What about for you? What do you love about what you do today?
It sounds so cliched, but for folks listening, my background has all been B2B technology. You're moving a lever, you're moving a number, and the fact that we get to help individuals lead more fulfilling careers now. Every day I get this huge rush out of folks accomplishing things they never thought they could. And wow, it's a heady process. So the success of our customers is what drives me. And I know it sounds so cliched, but it really does. And it's an awesome way to get up every day.
I have to admit, like, I'm coaching several SEs right now, and every time they come back with like some great news, it's just, it's better than getting, I don't know, thousands of dollars in commission.
It feels good.
Yeah, it's just it's intrinsic feeling versus monetary rewards. We need both, so it's great that you can actually have a job that allows you to get one from another.
Very fortunate. Yeah,
that's great. All right, second question of the day: is there anything you would change about how you do things, or how things are done in sales and sales engineering or startups today?
Again, I say this with love in my heart, being a founder. Founders need to get themselves out of the sales cycle as fast as they can. You got to close all the initial deals, totally. You got to realize that you have to professionalize the organization and bring in professionals to run it, because the way you're doing it just can't succeed. And so I would love to see more founders who, hold an honest mirror to themselves and hire in to get themselves out of it faster than they do right now.
Nice. I like that.
Our next question. So I guess you could maybe gear this towards, I guess, from the perspective of anyone, whether it be founders and better understanding their organizations, or just individuals looking to find a more fulfilling role, or anything in between, I guess. What are some books, tools, or resources may you recommend for people, I guess, looking to you to better understand their teams, or otherwise make that next move?
I'm going to give you one that sounds a little bit weird, but Leaders Under Fire. It has nothing to do with sales, nothing to do with sales engineering. It has everything to do with crisis management and crisis planning. But the real takeaway from the book is how even a small amount of really thoughtful planning at the beginning can save you so much heartache later. And it's a beautiful metaphor, but it also has some great frameworks for doing some of that early planning and thinking. And I think in sales and sales engineering, we're often so rushed, we don't take the time to actually plan in the bigger context. So that's one I'd recommend because, hey, great learning, but also just an amazing higher level takeaway for the way you run your role. That's Leaders Under Fire.
Awesome.
All right.
We'll add it to the show notes.
Next book on the list. Great. Final question of the not so fire round, not of the day, but of the not so fire round. Is there a habit you're working on today to improve in your personal or professional life, or you think sales professionals should be working on?
Oh man, I don't have a great one for that second half because right now I'm still working on the first half. Because of the pandemic and all the work from home restrictions, my personal fitness and lifestyle goals are out the window, and I am trying to recreate them, and I am not succeeding. So the one thing I'm working on is trying to figure out how do I get my own self-care back into kind of my lifestyle when the usual ways that I would were no longer available. And that's hard. It feels a little bit like recreating yourself. And I don't know if there's a good analogy in there for sales reps, but straight talking, that's what I'm working on.
Okay, nice. Well, thank you, Joseph. This has been amazing. We'd love to continue our conversation at a later date. If people want to reach out and connect with you, how can they do that?
Totally. You can always hit us up on our website, uvaro.com. And I mean, that's great for anyone who wants to get into this industry or is hiring in the industry. But I'm always happy to chat with people. Hit me up. I'm on most social media platforms as Joseph Fung, all one word, and happy to connect and chat.
We'll have a link to your LinkedIn and to Uvaro on our show notes. Thanks again, Joseph. This has been great.
Thanks, Ramsey. Thanks, Benny.
Take care.
All right. Well, thank you, Joseph, for coming on. Thank you for listening as well. I appreciate it. I would love to see what your takeaways are. I know there's a lot of people in the SE world and that join startups, and startups can be a little bit hectic. There is no guidance. The SE might be reporting to a random person, like a product person or a marketing person. Like, doesn't really matter. Sometimes we might be the only ones who know what sales engineering is. And even sometimes they hire brand new sales engineers who don't really know much, and they kind of have to scramble and figure it out. So hopefully this show kind of brings you some insight about how that world is and how hectic it is. And hopefully you can get something out of this episode and figure out how you're going to be able to do your job and why things are happening to you the way they are. And that's pretty much it. So if you did like it, make sure you share it and let people know about it. More importantly, for me, I'd love to know what your struggles are. If you're working at a startup, what are some of the common struggles that you face today? And if you're working at a bigger company, like maybe the startup has matured, how is it different? Is it any better? Is it worse? I'd love to learn a little bit more about you and your current situation. So there are many ways to reach me, whether you can on LinkedIn, you can comment on this post or the post that I make to let people know about this episode. You can reach me directly on LinkedIn. Ramsey@wetheSalesEngineers.com is my email. And if you can't remember it, you can always sign up to the newsletter. I send a weekly newsletter, and if you hit reply, if it doesn't go to spam, I tend to always answer, and that's happened a couple of times going to spam. So yeah, let's just leave it here. I appreciate you listening. I appreciate Joseph's time, and I will see you guys next time. With that, this is Ramsey signing off.